We have finally come to the 90s. The 90s were filled with a lot of influences from the 80s, but there were also aspects of fashion that changed completely. Japan had been facing a recession after the bubble period, and people started to wear more simple clothes. The vision of that time was not to wear luxury clothes.
先ほど渋かじって言った清楚系って言ってたんですけれども、この渋かじに対して小ギャルっていう文化が突然出てくる。
The upcoming of an opposite style of the shibukaji became popular. This was the Kogyaru style, a style which was kind of founded by the opening of the 109 building, a building where consumers could buy cheap clothes for young people and fast fashion.
勉強したっていう話も噂ではあったりするんだけれども、要は安いけどデザインがすごくいろんなデザインがあるっていうことで、コギャルの特徴はバブルよりもう少し
The clothes were cheap, but there was a diversity of design. The characteristic of the Kogyaru was that it was a bit more concentrated on the excessive part of the body-conscious style and sun-tanning your face black, which they called ganguro or gonguro. On that face they would paint the area around their eyes white and put a lot of makeup on their lips.
オタクとか今でいうメイドとかっていう日本のサブカルチャーの言葉があるけれども、もしかしたらコギャルとかガングロゴングロっていう人たちが日本のサブカルチャーを世界に発信した第一人者なのかなって僕は思ってます。
The otaku and maid culture of today's Japan might not be the first that brought Japanese subculture to the outside world. It might be the ganguro or gonguro that launched the Japanese fashion subculture to the outside world. Not like the DC brands, but more street fashion wise.
って言われるコギャルの人たちが発信なのかなっていうようなスタイルがあります。で、一方で、アメリカでいうとヒップホップとか
Also, the hip hop, grunge, and skater culture, American influence like music and street culture, were important to Japan.
そういうアメリカのストリート系、音楽系から来てるファッションっていうのも同時に日本にこの時代に入ってきましたと。ですけど、ランディ MC、ビースティボーイズみたいな音楽とともにそこで
The clothes that artists like Run DMC and Beastie Boys wore in their music videos became stylish.
新アディダスのトレーニングウェアみたいなものを着てる。だから今まで体育の授業で着てたような服がタウンウェアとして着出したり。
For instance, the full body Adidas tracking suit style.
なんていうのかな、ストリートファッションもあって、バブル崩壊があって、みんな贅沢はしない清楚にしようよっていう部分もあり。
So clothes that everyone would wear to the gym were now worn in the streets. This street fashion, the ganguro style, the recession and the vision of not wearing luxury clothes made the 90s so diverse. 2000, still recent, was a time of mixed culture and mixed fashion. There were no big musicians, film stars or people like Michiko-san. There were no role models. There were no fashion leaders in 2000. This caused people to think about what would fit them personally. The citizens of Japan started to look for clothing that fitted them. For instance, there were those models called Dokusha models. Magazines like Anon and Nonnon first had pro models on their pages, but because of the recession, they had no money to afford that anymore. So what they did was scout ordinary people who were fans of the magazines. People who could be your neighbor or friend could be seen on the magazine. This was also because there were no role models and people started to arrange clothing themselves.
要は身近にいる友達がここに載ってたりっていう読者モデル
This was the Dokusha model movement in the model
なぜかっ
industry.
ていうとカリスマがいなくなったから、もう少し等身大でファッションを楽しむ時代になって自分でアレンジしていく時代になったんで、モデルの世界でもそんな
Because people started arranging clothes themselves, people started to feel like stylists
自分
themselves.
でアレンジするから、自分がスタイリストみたいになった人たちが多いんでロックファッションとフォークロアとか全く
What they did was
ない
mixing
ファッションを
styles like rock fashion and folklore fashion. They put completely separate styles
自
together.
分をプレゼンテーションできる服であればロックだから全身黒でないといけないとかっていう規制概念を
By doing so, they broke the norm of styles.
自由に
They did not wear all black anymore just because they were rock
その背景
fashion.
には売り場っていうのも変わってきてネットで買い物できるしネットで、自分の服を売ったり
People
も
became
でき
liberated.
るし
Furthermore, people could now buy and sell fashion online, also from foreign countries, which made the Japanese fashion culture even more diverse.
文化が生まれ出したのかなっていうだからこれから先販売チャンネルももっとその
I myself think that there will be more markets popping up, but for instance, when a role model becomes more popular, people don't copy the person, but they make it their own. I think the future will become such an era.
これからクリエイターが育ってほしいなっていうそういう新しい時代になっていくのかな
In short, we were unconsciously wearing wafku, and after the war, we were wearing Western
戦
clothes.
争などいろんなことがあって洋服に変わって文化が変わりましたでもそれは自分たちが選んできたんではなくてとにかく
This was not something that we ourselves chose to do. We were just craving for information. We were wondering about how we should wear clothes and what kind of fashion leaders there were. We were not thinking about how we could wear clothes, but we were controlled by fashion rules.
人を選ばない男女も老人も子供も選ばないワンサイズで
As I've said before, kimonos don't choose the wearer.
でも洋服は
Everybody could
人を
wear
選ぶ
kimonos.
サイズとかそういった意味でそれが徐々に2000年代に入ってきて和服ではないんだけれども
But Western clothes
日本人が持ってる
choose the wearer.
和服か洋服
And
なんだけれども
gradually, since the 2000s, Western clothes became as free as wearing as the wafku.
感じてます
The more avant-garde, eccentric and daring subcultures of Japan came also like the trends after the Second World War. After the war, there was a generation which could remember the past still clearly. They were hardworking and had conservative norms of Orthodox Japan. The children of that generation were in contrast to their parents hedonistic and individualistic. That caused the rise of countercultures and subcultures. When the bubble period of Japan began, people started not saving but started spending money. They could indulge themselves outside of work. The rise of media, such as music and movies, also brought great inspiration for the subcultures. When the economic recession took place in Japan, consumers started wearing affordable street fashion. Work and society was so exhausting that people began to use fashion as an escape exit. There were no role models, there was internet and the wearer him and herself.
日本のサブカルチャーっていうのはまあ世界的にも
I think that Japanese subcultures are evaluated by foreign countries.
オタクとかまあメイド喫茶とかメイドとかもそうだよね
Things like manga, otaku, and maid cafes, for
驚
instance.
きにならずに来た文化だったはずが、ここ数年で例えばポケモン GO だったりとかまあ
Originally, the Japanese subculture was a culture that existed without becoming major.
安倍マリオ安倍首相がマリオの格好して出てきたりとかこんなのどこの国もやったことないし
But in recent years, it had become major with things like Pokemon Go, Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, and the Olympics in Rio, where Abe Mario, the president wearing a Mario costume, was presented.
日本の首相っていう人たちもそういう着ぐるみのようなファッションをしだしたっていう。
Because it is Japan, something that was only for insiders such as otakus, Japanese geeks, was launched to the outside and finally had reached people like the president.
表現する場がまた見てもらう場が増えて それが数値化されて
The exit of subcultures has become big because of an increase in platforms like the internet and YouTube, where people can express themselves. People who were called an otaku can now be evaluated. I am convinced that in 2020, the year of the next Olympics, there will be a culture more prominent, more evaluated, and more bigger than the contemporary Japanese subculture in the future.
サブカルチャーよりもさらに世界に評価されるようなカルチャー、ソフトのパワーが芽生えてくると思います。
At the beginning of Japanese fashion history, Japan wore traditional Japanese clothing, the kimono. In addition, several types of Japanese traditional clothing were worn, among others the furisode, uchikake, and yukata. The traditional clothing has had different goals, shapes, color combinations, and techniques. The value of the kimono has also changed. Kimonos makers became more advanced in their profession. Because of this, making kimonos became an art form, and so kimonos became more expensive. Parents also passed on their valuable kimonos to their children as family titles. In addition, the influence of the West changed the production system of kimonos in Japan. There were informal kimonos and department stores filled with them. Despite this change, the kimono has retained its characteristic appearance. The kimono has changed little. After 200 years of separation from the outside world, Japan opened its doors again for trade. Culture transfers took place between Japanese and Western culture. Gradually, the Japanese population began to wear more Western clothing, such as uniforms. At the same time, a mutual interest took place. Western fashion designers were inspired by Japanese techniques and clothing. In the course of history, certain major changes took place, such as the major earthquake in Kanto and the Second World War, which caused the middle and low class of Japan to think about the functionality of traditional Japanese clothing. They could not easily work, move, and mainly flee emergency and danger, which caused the westernization of the Japanese fashion. After the World Wars, the Japanese attained more time and money to express their sense of fashion. Different trends and subcultures arose, some completely based on the West, others based on Japanese influences, and some a mix of West and Japan. As Japan grew, the more Japanese culture mixed with other influences and less traditional Japanese clothing was worn. Still, Japan retained something eccentric, something typically Japanese. That is how Japanese clothing changed and is changing in the course of Japanese history. I myself hope that the traditional Japanese culture will continue to exist together with the kimono. In addition, I am very curious about Olympic Games in 2020, which might bring big changes for Japan. I hope that because of such great events and changes, various new styles will arise. I hope that it will be a unique style, culture, and clothing that differs from the West. I am very curious about the future Japan. Perhaps then I can make a documentary again.